Which I mean, we know.
Okay, what else do I have to do? Share my screen. And then we're good.
Push a button.
And push, wait a minute, I gotta do that. Yeah, how was Harrisburg?
Regards from
Thank you. Okay, let's take a look. Okay, so this was the question that we had started with, raising goats and sheep in Eretz Yisrael. And we had seen the psak in the Shulchan Aruch, Ein megadlin behema daka be'eretz Yisrael, mipnei shedarkam liros bisdot zarim vehezeka matzoi. Shulchan Aruch paskins, you're not allowed to raise small farm animals in Eretz Yisrael because they tend to graze and wander in the fields of other people, and it's prevalent that they damage. Ulam himshich marna shulchan aruch sham v'kosav de bizman hazeh she'in matzui sheyusados liYisrael be'eretz Yisrael nir shemutar. He says, but the Shulchan Aruch then writes, but nowadays, when it's not prevalent that there are going to be a lot of private land owned by Jews, it seems that it is permitted. We're going to skip the footnote for now. Amnam zehaya bisman maran, but that was in the times of the Machaber in the 16th century. V'nechluku haposkim mahadin bismanenu she'eretz Yisrael biyad haYehudim v'holechet u'mityashevet. Poskim debate what should be the halacha today when Eretz Yisrael is so densely populated in the hands of the Jews. Choser hadavar li'isurot. The things go back to their prohibition. Hagon Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank hayadaitu lahater kevin shebemeshach hazman shelo hayishuv Yisrael hutar legadol behema daka. Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank says, listen, once the heter was dispensed when Jews were not living there, right? Shuv ein hadover neser rak al yedei minyan chadash. We can only re-prohibit it with another convening beis din. B'chol zman shelo nigzar b'minyan mechadash zekamo gezerah chadasha shelo gozrim midaitenu. And so long as that hasn't happened, no one individual rabbi has the right to make such a gezerah. Ulam b'shut yabia omer chalak alav v'dachet rayato mishvias v'hela le'esor af bizman hazesh keven shehayishuv shel Yisrael. But Rav Ovadia disagrees, and he says now that we've gone back to the original times, as far as the Metzias, as far as what's going on in Israel today. Then the original Gezerah does go into effect. And he writes, we'll get to the footnote in just a second. I want to get to the bottom. Oh, that's it. That's it. That's all. Okay. So
accept it.
Now we have to unpack all of this because basically based on what Rav Sharaga is writing, you would not be allowed to have a goat in your backyard in Eretz Yisrael, which is reasonable, and it would seem to be. It shouldn't be that there shouldn't be any distinction between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz based on the considerations of damage. Now, let's take a look at some of the principles that we're going to be deriving from this very short tshuva. So if we take a look at the Makor Baruch in Os Aleph, he says, Lichora Kasha. He says, it would seem problematic for the Shulchan Aruch to all of a sudden say that now that there's not a prevalence of Jews in Eretz Yisrael in the 16th century, it now becomes permissible once again to have goats in Eretz Yisrael. He says, that seems difficult. Dahakaimalan bevetza. We have a Gemara in Beya that says, Kol davar shebeminyan tzarich minyan acher lahatiro. That anytime the rabbis banned a law or created a new takana, you need another equally viable beis din to undo it. And so long as they haven't undone it, you have to abide by the original takana, even though the reasons for that original takana do not apply. What do you think the discussion is in Maseches Beitza over there? Yes, exactly.
Wow.
2-day Yontif. That's exactly the discussion. And the Gemara says, we know exactly when Kviya Diyarcha is. We know exactly when Rosh Chodesh is. Why in the world, just because back then there were Samaritans who were trying to mess up our calendar, and we originally had cloud signals, and then they started their own cloud signals to try and confound us. And then, so therefore, no one outside of Eretz Yisrael knew what day of Yontif it was, because they didn't know what day Rosh Chodesh was. And it became a whole balagan. And so therefore, they made a takana that you have to have 2 days. But now that we have a fixed calendar, why can't we just go back to 1-day Yontif? And so this is the most unpopular answer known to the Jewish people, right? Is that because once it was instituted, you can't change it, even though the reason no longer applies. And the reason it's so unpopular is because, can you imagine you tell that to your wife? She's going to say, I don't care. You get your rabbis together. I want my 1-day Yontif, right? But it doesn't work that way. Yeah. Right.
So why can't the beis din get together and change it?
Because it has to be as great in number and in stature. And
What has to be as great?
the new beis din.
Oh,
And because it's not as great in number, because
nobody would ever declare that.
right. Once the rabbis, this is going back. This is arguably even during temple times. So it might probably towards the end of the Second Temple period when this takana was originally made.
So that's impossible. The farther away from Har Sinai, the less chance.
Presumably so. Now, we certainly hope, first of all, when, Mashiach comes, almost all Jews will go back to Eretz Yisrael, but there will probably still remain Jews in the diaspora. And maybe by that time, they'll be able to undo some of the original takanas, especially the 2-day Yontif deal. But you don't know. Anyway, because of Harasham, the wrote Salomar, Kol davar shenigzar b'minyan chachamim, and the Rush explains that anything that was decreed with a consensus of rabbis, the Yadua me'eza tam nigzera hagzera, and we know exactly why they made that takana. Ubatel oso hatam, and the reason no longer applies. V'imkein hayaroish hagzera titbatel, and therefore it would have been only logical to nullify the gzera. Afilu hachi ena betela ad sheyimnu aleh chachamim v'yatiruha. You still can't nullify it until the chachamim come to consensus and nullify it. Now there are certain exceptions to this rule. Not really exceptions, but the rabbis banned. Here's another example. The rabbis banned stam yenam. Stam yenam they banned. Now, what does stam yenam mean? Any wine that is manufactured by a non-Jew is not permitted. There are 2 reasons for this. One is because we're concerned they're going to use it for idolatrous purposes. And the other one is because we're concerned about intermarriage. Because when you drink together with Gentiles, you're going to become too chummy with them. And then you may end up having, it may lead to mixed dancing. That's right.
Does the same apply to milk?
To what?
To milk, dairy product food has to be washed.
No. So that's a different reason. That's because we're concerned that non-cow milk may be mixed in.
No, the reason, but was it around the same?
Oh,
time?
so that's the question, is that's also around the same time.
Yeah.
So when do we say that once the reason no longer applies, the takana is no longer extant? And when do we say, no, we have to hold fast to it, even though the reason no longer applies? Now, built into it's and we'll get to this in a minute. Obviously, the question is, how can we all of a sudden say that even though the rabbis banned us from having goats in from raising goats in Eretz Yisrael, all of a sudden, now that the reason no longer applies, you can now have goats in Eretz Yisrael. But what about this principle that we're learning about now? Once the takana was made, you cannot rescind it, even though the reason no longer applies.
Right.
So that's where we're at loggerheads. Okay, so Vimkain eichekel bizeb maran hashulchan aruch mishum shenit batel tama takana. That's exactly his question. Va'ain mashakasav bazer Rabbeinu hagadol b'shut yabia oimer liyashev al pid divrei shut harosh. He says, I refer you to Rav Ovadia's tshuva, who talks about this, where he quotes the Rosh, who says, the klal zenemer dafke b'makom sha'atam lo yadua kolkach. He says that general rule that once Chazal make a takana, you cannot undo it when the reason no longer applies, is only when we're not 100% certain about the reason. He says, Aval heicha shahatam yadua, but when the reason is crystal clear, then amrinan dim batal tam batal hatakana. Then we do say that if the reason no longer applies, the takana is no longer in effect. Vehevi sheken kasav gam hagon milublin b'shut toiras chesed ad kan toichen devar. He quotes another great gadol who says that, and that's what he holds. B'tzarich bir, but he says, but that's also not so clear. The hare harosh bebeitzer kasav lahedge deklal zenemar gam hecha shatam yadua. He says because the Rosh in his commentary to the Gemara says that even when you know the reason for the takana still must remain in effect. Ve'al korchenu tzarich lechalek the kavanas harosh bebeitzahi shatam legzeres chazal yadua lechachmei hador the kaven shenispat lo hayaroishe titbatel hagezera kamash malon the tzarich minyan acher lahatira. He says it doesn't mean when the Rosh says the reason was known for having 2 days yontif, it doesn't mean that it was made known to every generation, but the rabbis of that generation were aware of it, and even though the reason was not no longer in effect, they felt that they could not abandon the takana. Aval b'shut harosh ayri b'chaygavne shetama takana yadua lekol Yisrael. But in the Rosh in his Tshuvas, who says that once the takana's reason is no longer applicable, the takana is no longer in effect, that's when the reason is known to everybody, to all of Klal Yisrael. But he says once the reason that is known to everyone no longer applies, so then the takana is blocked. Now, the Gemara itself says that even though the reason for the takana has been removed as far as 2 days yontif, but they still wanted it to stay in effect because you never know when things could become chaotic on a civilizational level, and maybe we'll lose our calculations, and maybe we'll have to resort back to Kiddush al pi hara'iyah to sanctify the new moon through sightings, and maybe there'll be other groups who might mess us up and try to confuse us. And in other words, it seems like built into the takana was even when the apparent reason is removed, because, there's no longer Samaritans, but you never know. You never know what could happen.
Why isn't there two in Israel?
Because we don't need cloud signals to notify the people in Eretz Yisrael. You just have runners. You have people who go throughout all of Israel, and there's enough time between Rosh Chodesh and the 15th of the month.
Don't you think that's a good justification for someone from Chutz La'aretz to go to Israel? They only have to keep 1 day. under that.
Well, that's a separate issue. That's a separate question. Wayne, you're.
I tried for you guys.
That's a separate issue. Like, what's the status of a person who lives regularly in Chutz La'aretz? Okay, but that's neither here nor there as far as this discussion that we're having. Okay. Anyway, Omnam Hayir. Yes.
Does Kitniyah fall into the same situation that we're talking about now? As
Actually, you could make an argument that Kitnius, that's a good question, Shmuel. Kitnius does not fall into the same category that we're discussing because Kitnius was a regional minhag. So I think it's much more arguable that Kitnius is something that it can be at some point dropped once you know that the reason no longer applies. But with that said, there's a long-standing tradition when it comes to Pesach that we always upgrade our chumras. We never downgrade our chumras, and try to convince your wife to eat kitnias on Pesach. She'll call you a shaygitz and throw you out of her house. So I mean, that's just the nature of the Jewish people. Okay.
What about stuff like the Brooks or all these, like, there's so
Yeah, it's
many.
the same thing. But these are all regional, these were regional minhagim that were adopted after the time of the Gemara. Those, gebrachts and kitnias and other minhagim having to do with all different kinds of practices. They're regional minhagim that are upheld because there's standards that the community sets. And once you're part of a religious community, you can't, unless you get a consensus of the leadership of the community, it's very hard to undo those minhagim. But if a person will, let's say, leave that community and wanted to go to another community, I think it would be much easier of an argument to make if an Ashkenazi, let's say, went ahead and left his Ashkenazi community, which can't really be done anymore today because Ashkenazim and Sephardim all live together. But let's say in the old day, if an Ashkenazi left Poland and went to live in Morocco, let's say, and was there for many, many years, I think arguably it could be that he might be able to be makel after being there for a certain amount of time.
I have a cousin who's very young, who changed all his minhagim from Ashkenaz to Sephardi.
Mhm.
Why? Like he moved.
Because he was much more, no, he lives in Malayadumi. He was inspired by Sephardic governing. He was way more than Ashkenaz. And he got upset. He changed over everything, his tefillin, davens, everything.
Yeah, a lot of us. There's a lot of us who are Sephardi wannabes.
Until it comes the month before.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, really. Now switching back. Yeah.
No.
I'm off this week.
Okay. Omnam hayanira liyashev es psak maran hashulchan aruch kan al pi yesod shekasav hapri chadash. He says you could, however, explain the psak of the Mechaber to be lenient based on something that the Pri Chadash writes. The Hinei kasav maran b'shulchan aruch mashkim shenitgalu asrum chachamim dechayshin shemashata nachash mehem vehitil behem aras. Here's another example. The Shulchan Aruch writes, if water or other beverages were left exposed overnight, you're not allowed to drink from those beverages because we're concerned that maybe a snake came in the middle of the night and left some of its venom in the beverage. Okay, so it could be poisonous. But then the Mechaber says, but nowadays that we don't have snakes prevalent in our communities, although there's some two-legged snakes that I know.
Yeah.
But anyway, then it's mutter, then you're allowed to drink the exposed beverage. So the Iksha Pri Chadasham, Da'atzarch Minyan Acher Lahatira. But the Pri Chadash asks, but don't you need an official lifting of the ban by a Beis Din in order to permit you to do that? B'chilek tehecha shechazal gazu leser al kol hamekamot b'shaveh az efshar lahatir et hadavar ela binyan chadash. He says when something was non-regional, but it was declared across the board, then you cannot lift the ban unless you have a governing body, rabbinic body that can do that. Aval heicha shafilu bizman chazal hagzera hayta rak al mekamot mesuyamim uvemakom shelo shayach tam hagzera lo asru. But he says, but even when the original ban only applied to certain regions where there was a concern, let's say, about dangerous snakes, but even when they made the ban, it wasn't universal, it didn't apply to places where there were no snakes. Memela hayom b'makom shelo shayach yoter tam hagzera chazar dinu liot k'makom shelo nigzar alav. Then you can say that nowadays, when the reason no longer applies in Eretz Yisrael, it's now permitted. ועל פי זה, כוסף שהיום מותר לשתות מים מגולים, כיוון שאפילו בזמן התקנה, היו מקומות שלא היו מצויים שם נחשים. He says, and therefore, even in the times of Chazal, there were places where snakes were not prevalent, ולא הייתה גזירה על אותם המקומות, and therefore the gzera never extended to those places. ועל פי זה, יש לומר גם בנידון דידן. And therefore, perhaps we can make the same argument when it comes to raising goats. The harei afilu midina de gemar lo gazru al midbarot shel Eretz Yisrael kevin shelo hayasham yishuv Yehudim. When the rabbis made their original decree, they didn't include desert land in Eretz Yisrael. They didn't include, let's say, places like Be'er Sheva, okay, because since Jews were not prevalently populated there, it was never a concern that the goats would damage or steal other people's property. Shulchan Aruch himself writes, Lachein yesh lomar shebizman she'ein yishuv Yehudim afilu ba'ayarot, and therefore, in a historical period, let's say in the 16th century, where the Jewish population was sparse even in cities, chazar dinam liot kemidbariot shalehem lo gazru chazal. Then it's okay. You can basically say, the original takana did not apply to deserts. Today, our cities are so sparsely populated that they're like deserts. And therefore, that's why the takana of raising goats doesn't apply. So that's the reason why, even though the takana was a very official takana, but it only applies when the population is a certain density. Once that density goes lower than the times of when Chazal made the takana, then you're allowed to raise goats again. So that's really just to address the issue of why you can just so easily undo a takana that was made by our sages. There are certain times when you simply can't, because either the reason is not so crystal clear why the takana exists, or the rabbis baked into the takana that they never wanted it to be lifted, okay? But then there are other times when accompanying the takana, a reason is provided, right? And once that reason is no longer prevalent, the takana is lifted. When it comes to, I was talking about the prohibition of Gentile wine. So the two reasons, one of the two reasons really is no longer extant, because nowadays Gentiles are not idolatrous, okay? Idolatry is something that's largely been sort of lost from modern civilization. So does that mean now that it's okay to drink Gentile wine? So the answer is no, with an asterisk. No, because the second reason still does apply. And as we know, that's why, kosher wine is such a big industry, because we can't drink Gentile wine. However, the Ramah has certain leniencies in discussing Gentile wine based on the fact that nowadays Gentiles are no longer idolatrous. You see, when Chazal made their takana on Gentile wine, they also said that it has the same status as if the Gentile had actually used the wine for idolatry. Even if you have no reason to suspect that, but all Gentile wine has to be treated as idolatry wine. And the Ramah says nowadays that Gentiles don't worship idols, even though that wine is prohibited for consumption, but it's not as high of a prohibition as wine that was used for idolatry. And why is that? Because wine used for idolatry is asur bahana. You can't even get benefit from it. Let's say you want to sell bottles of Gentile wine. You wouldn't be permitted to even make money off of that. When it comes to Gentile wine, stam yenam bisman hazeh, there are times when you can be lenient in that halacha.
What about like alcohol, like beer or schnapps?
Was never included in the
But
takana.
it goes according to the second reason you said that it leads to.
It leads to
mixed dancing.
it leads to mixed dancing. It leads to intermarriage.
Right.
So you can't extend the takana beyond that which Chazal made it. That when they originally made the takana, it only extended to wine, because that was the prevalent drink of
Was there beer
merriment.
at that time? Maybe there was no beer.
There was definitely beer at that time. It's called sheikhar. It was, and what we translate today is mead. They used to make a beer not only out of grain but also out of dates. Yeah, they fermentation.
Molson's existed.
Yeah, yeah.
Molson.
Fermentation was something that was well known all the way back to ancient times. Right?
Mead was a honey tradition.
What's that?
Mead was like a honey drink, alcoholic drink.
It was made out of dates in the times of the Talmud.
Oh, that's what it was, honey.
Honey,
It's
sweet
dates.
dates.
Yeah, sweet. It was sweet.
So Rabbi, so medicine on Shabbos, so we don't grind anymore, so that's when it's the.
Another great example. We don't grind anymore. So there are times when you find that the poskim are lenient depending upon the nature of the illness. Right? So even though the takana is still in place, but there's like an asterisk next to it that says there are times and places when you can be lenient if the person is suffering to such an extent, yada yada yada. Okay,
Doesn't seem very clear. It seems like every case is.
it's all a case by case. And it's interesting that you say that, because it's explicitly stated, I forget where, but in Hilchos Shabbos, you can't always be medama milta lamilta. You can't always extrapolate from one case to another. Every takana in Hilchos Shabbos is unique. And just because sometimes you find the poskim being lenient in one area does not give you liberty to be lenient in another area. And, it's like Laser wrote that article in the Chachmei Lev about using scooters on Shabbos. Perfect example of social conventions that sometimes evolve over the course of time. Right now, in Florida, for example, many congregations that are from allow, the riding of scooters because it's really, really hot. And no one likes to walk in the heat.
You mean the two-wheel?
Yeah,
things?
yeah, the razors, Is that what they're called?
Yeah.
That's a brand, yeah.
It's a brand.
Yeah.
Rabbi,
Yeah, Shmuel.
Hindu and other Eastern religions, are they still considered to be idolatrous religions?
Great question. Great question. Very unclear. Very unclear in the poskim. Remember that Shaitel crisis that came up a few years back, right? So it seems from the modern day poskim that they do believe that Hinduism is idolatry. The question is, of course, when you're manufacturing hundreds of thousands of dollars of human hair for wigs, are they using that for idolatrous purposes? That was the point that was made by a number of other rabbis. But in theory, there seems to have been consensus that Hinduism is still a form of idolatry. Not clear if that's always true, though, but more to discuss. We still have to do the second footnote, because this machlokas between the Rav Ovadia and Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank as whether the takana goes back into effect, something we need to talk a little bit about more. We'll look at that on Choshen tomorrow. All right, have a great day, everybody.